I was born and raised on this land, and my early recollections were of a vast open area with a multitude of pine stumps and old slash.
We would take everything off that was worth taking off, and the rest we'd leave just the brush for about a year until it got dried out, and then we'd start a fire and burn everything except the stumps. That was all that was left.
As a child, going up to Park Falls by train, I remember looking out of the train windows and thinking of horrible scenery. There were blackened trees and stumps.
And the scenery wasn't exactly scenic.
We always hear about the robber barons that came up here. They bought land for $1.25 an acre and just ruined the whole north. Well, we had a nation to build.
The forests that covered so much of the country had to be cleared to make room for the newcomers from the other side of the ocean. Fields, barns, houses, towns, and cities grew up. The raw material fueling this growth was the essence of the forests that covered much of what would become the state of Wisconsin. These thick, endless wooded panoramas were seen as an inexhaustible mine of timber.
Wisconsin was rich in its forest resources, and even though there's been a lot of criticism of so-called timber barons, the progress that Wisconsin made would not have been possible without them being on the scene.
The economic power of the lumber industry reached its zenith just as they tapped out all of the prime virgin 200-300-year-old pine and sent it to market. And that was in about the 1890s. That's when the great fortunes were accumulated by people like Stevenson, Sawyer, Pierce. We have some counties named after those men.
While the progress was impressive, the price of liquidating the land and forest resources could be seen in lunar landscapes, erosion, poor crops, and a plague of wildfires that swept through the Northland like storms from hell itself. This was the legacy of the 19th century, a precious resource looking like it had been snatched from future generations. But out of this bleak picture, a system of laws and regulations would evolve to heal the damaged land and reestablish the forests. Accomplishing this will take the energy and dedication of concerned citizens, business leaders, and especially the tireless labors of a small group of individuals who carved out a new profession called forestry. This is the story of the forests and the foresters of Wisconsin, a place steeped in a rich and colorful history of the struggles and victories around this key resource so deeply related to our social, economic, and environmental well-being. Forestry, a vocation born of the need to care for the land while meeting the present and future needs of society for the tangible and emotional wealth that the forest provides. How do you create a system that maintains some sort of rational balance between inherently conflicting demands on the forest? On the one side, our need to protect natural habitats, maintain biodiversity, and safeguard precious watersheds. And on the other side, our unquenchable demand for the products of the forest and the ever-growing ways we use the forest for recreation.
It's hard for people to remember now, looking back on the 19th century, is that the way lumbering happened in the 19th century was utterly different from the way it is now. Forests were consumed at an extraordinary rate, as if they were a non-renewable resource, meaning that lumbermen would move through a forest, cut down only the trees that they wanted, and leave behind essentially a waste. Forestry emerges out of the recognition at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that that's not a viable way to relate to the forests, that you simply cannot relate to forests in that way and help to sustain not just the industry of lumbering, but the communities that live on the land.
Early migrants from Europe saw the forests as something to be removed. The resulting over-harvest of the northern part of the state led to a push to sell the stripped land to settlers. But there was more land than demand, and much of it not suited to farming.
The state, through the Extension Service, in the 1920s, they started a program up in this country of trying to convert the forest land, the cutover forest land, to farmland. Now, northern Wisconsin has very few acres of prime agricultural land. And as a result, the settlers came up here, they bought a 40 or an 80, and they tried to farm that. And because of short growing seasons and cold winters, and market conditions being such as they were, they had to abandon and go back down south to take up agriculture if they could afford to.
Many would be ruined within a few years. The counties and the small group of remaining people were left stranded, like shipwrecks in a landlocked sea of unemployment and tax-delinquent properties. As greater pieces of the forest were carved out by both settlers and loggers, fire would become the major event that followed the axe. Some estimate that there were over 2,000 forest fires annually, burning over 500,000 acres every year during the 19th century.
In those years, there was no forest protection program. And so a fire would start and it'd burn over thousands and thousands of acres. And as many times those fires were so hot that it burned the very vegetation and also the seed that was in the ground. If that hadn't happened, then many of these lands would have naturally grown back to trees.
But unless the fires directly threatened settlements, nobody much worried about them. The public attitude was typical of people moving into a wilderness. Many actually felt that the fires would clear more land and stimulate agricultural development. And others felt that the forests were so huge that it was foolish to think that there was any limit to the supply of timber.
These fires, these slash fires that burn through Peshtigo and other places are so terrifying, so enormous, so destructive. They burn hundreds of square miles of land, they kill hundreds of people. Many more people died in Peshtigo than died in Chicago the same weekend when the fires burned. But they become, I think, a symbol for Americans at the end of the 19th century of something that is wrong with the way that they're relating to the land. They become a symbol of waste. And one of the things that happens in the 19th century is an emerging critique of this wastefulness, where the fire is one symbol of waste.
The next step after that was the coming of the CCC program, 1933. Franklin Roosevelt was given the credit for that.
The CCC program started to be phased out as World War II came on, and the leadership of our department at that time were trying to figure out how they could replace these big crews of firefighters. That started us with the business of using tractors and plows to corral forest fires with. It was the fires of the 30s that caused the legislature to amend the Constitution and permit the state to levy a tax on property all over the state, the proceeds of which were to do two things: to prevent forest fires and provide money for reforestation. And so there is that broad public support for resource protection and forestry protection that has gone over the decades, over the century, and has been bipartisan in nature.
Restoration really was made possible by legislative acts. One, to control fire, and two, to provide a reasonable taxation. The legislature gave recognition to the fact taxes were a deterrent to forestry. And they then enacted, in the late 20s, the Forest Crop Law. the forest crop law made it possible for anyone in the state of Wisconsin to invest in forestry with the fire protection that existed at the time and the lower taxes under the forest crop law.
By 1927, the parties with the greatest historical conflict about forest management would actively endorse the state's forest protection programs. Lumber and logging associations and conservation groups found common ground. Many of the ruined farms would wind up in county hands from the non-payment of taxes. The sadness of these transfers was to have a brighter side, however, the creation of the county forest.
In Wisconsin, our state constitution provided that tax delinquent land reverted back to the counties. And in Minnesota and in Michigan, those same tax delinquent lands, which occurred throughout the Lake States area after the cutover and burnover, those lands reverted back to state ownership.
In our county, I think the biggest boost came about in the early 30s to the middle 30s. At that time, the people on the county board and the public in general was faced with a dilemma. We had tens of thousands of acres of cut-over land where nothing was done to start a new crop of trees. It was abandoned, in essence. Taxes weren't paid, it became tax delinquent. Now the problem was, what do we do with that land? And about that time, the county forest law was generated, and the counties become aware of it. My personal opinion is that the county forests in northern Wisconsin are one of the most valuable assets we have in the state of Wisconsin.
Out of these regulatory efforts, the concept of a state forestry program was born. By 1903, the first comprehensive forestry legislation would be passed. During the decade of 1910, Wisconsin would see the creation of state forests, establishment of a reforestation fund, plus funds for water conservation and recreation activities. Also at this time, a state commission discovered, with the perspective of hindsight, what may be obvious today, that the remaining forests of southern Wisconsin were no longer adequate to meet the basic needs of the residents of the area. By 1924, the people of Wisconsin, by an overwhelming majority, passed an amendment to the state constitution allowing the state to appropriate money to buy, preserve, and develop forest lands.
There were people, fortunately, who had the foresight to see the potential of that land for producing many benefits for the citizens of the state.
As Americans begin to be concerned about what's happening to the forest, and there are certain benchmarks for that, the 1880 census is famous. It has first time in history, it has an entire volume devoted to surveying the problems with American forests. And it becomes a kind of clarion call to people worried about whether what we're doing is sustainable. And you begin to get a group of people, mainly in the Northeast, who are worried about changing American forest practices. They look primarily to France and Germany for inspiration. People like Bernard Furneaux, a crucial figure in this, Griffith Pinchot, who will be the head of the new Forest Service, as it begins to be called that, under the Teddy Roosevelt administration. Pinchot is responsible for founding the Yale Forestry School, which becomes a center with Cornell and a couple of other schools in training foresters. And it is out of that set of training, that set of programs, that the first foresters who come to Wisconsin arrive.
E.M. Griffith was the first state forester, named to his post in 1904, and given a budget of $3,000.
E.M. Griffith, Aldo Leopold, those were pioneers, and the foresters were the first who could demonstrate to the public and to business that it makes more economic and social sense to treat the forest properly rather than to just slice it off and run away from it.
A lot of people don't know that Leopold was trained as a forester. He went to Griffith Pinchot's Yale Forestry School and did all of his early training with the United States Forest Service in the American Southwest. Unquestionably, he thought as a forester, he thought about the land and the sustaining of the land in ways that were utterly informed by forestry. But he brought some different perspectives to that project, which really changed forestry in the middle of the 20th century. For Leopold, forests were not just about commodity production of lumber, though he was not hostile to the commodity production of lumber. They were also homes to all sorts of wild creatures that were very important to Leopold as a hunter, if nothing else. So that game management is a big part of the way he thinks about forests. Forests are habitats for the animals that we hunt, that we relate to, and that share the ecosystem with us. So in Leopold's hands, forestry becomes a science and a management practice that is as much about sustaining an ecosystem and a home for creatures as it is about cutting down trees for lumber.
The Wisconsin Forestry Hall of Fame at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point honors these and many other early leaders of Wisconsin forestry.
Those field foresters that worked in the trenches out there, getting trees established on the site, replanting them, protecting them from fire, have provided a legacy of which we can use to manage today. So when I reflect back on my career, where we are today, sure, there's a lot of controversy, a lot of criticism relative to the use of clear cuts and so forth. But I think we all should keep in sharp focus the forest resource that we are leaving today, that other people have the opportunity to mold, to manipulate, to change for whatever those desires of Wisconsin citizenry are for the future.
I think the people of years ago who got things rolling for forestry are the biggest asset to our good program today.
Today, forests cover nearly half of Wisconsin and once again play a critical role in providing social and ecological benefits, as well as being a key to Wisconsin's economic prosperity. The 16 million acres of forests in Wisconsin support a growing tourism business and also a diverse forest products industry that's among the top 3 employers in 42 of Wisconsin's 72 counties.
I think with the economy of the state of Wisconsin and the large dependence we have on Wisconsin's forest industry, that we can hit both targets, provide that raw material, but at the same time moving existing stands into some semblance of a better condition for the future.
The average American uses about 749 pounds of paper every year. When you add this to the fact that 95% of all houses are constructed with wood, you come to the dramatic equivalent of one 100-foot-high, 16-inch diameter tree used by each American every year. Yet each year in Wisconsin alone, about 25 million tree seedlings are planted. An even greater number of new trees grow as a result of natural regeneration. So even with all the demands on the forest, Wisconsin has been able to create 640,000 acres of new forest in a little over 1 decade. This comes from good forest management. Our demand on the forest today is not very different from the demands of 100 years ago, and commercial interests are still in occasional conflict with conservation interests. But today, we have the protection of laws and public policy to keep us from ever returning to the over-harvesting days of the past. This happened because of foresters' commitment to education, sharing information with the public, working with the private landowners who own the majority of Wisconsin's forests, and ensuring that the practice of forestry evolves as new science and technology is discovered.
We try to get across the idea that the natural resources need to be managed, and properly managed and wisely used for the long-term good of everyone. You've got a rather finite resources system, but an expanding population. People simply have to learn to talk to each other and understand other people's conflicting viewpoint so that the resources system can be made to be useful and enjoyable today as well as into the future.
Private woodland owners are constantly changing. The ownership is changing. So there's always a new clientele of people that need to be schooled or educated in proper stewardship of their property and of their land. So private woodland management is an unending educational endeavor for all of us.
The future of the forest is in the hands of everyone, the general public and the private individuals who own 60% of Wisconsin's forests. It's all a matter of balance. Balance which has not only been achieved by legislation, but by the realization that there's a great deal of common ground between these diverse interests. And this common ground has been defined and maintained by our foresters. The ravages of the 19th century are long gone. And after over 100 years of struggle, of learning hard lessons, Wisconsin is a place that is once again endowed with vast tracts of forest. But unlike earlier times, today's forests are a carefully managed and carefully protected resource. One that fulfills a vast number of needs, from lumber harvesting to hunting, to bird watching, to protecting our environment from the threats of erosion and water pollution.
As we try to imagine how we can build a sustainable future, not just for humanity, but for the earth, one of the important lessons to draw from the Wisconsin experience, I think, is the lesson that Leopold first began to articulate, and that really has been part of Wisconsin's relationship to land all along, which is we have to take responsibility for the whole. We have to recognize that there are certain ways of relating to the land that are unsustainable. Arguably, what we did in northern Wisconsin in the 19th century is precisely what's happening in Brazil at the beginning of the 21st century. And so the paths that Wisconsin folks and Americans followed in trying to build a more sustainable forest practice are the kinds of issues that we have to confront in the same way in the third world or in places in the tropical rainforest. The one other lesson I'd add to that is that Wisconsin is a place where people live in the forest, where the forest is cheek by jowl with communities that use the forest not just for logging, not just for jobs, not just for hunting, not just for recreation, but for all of those things. And surely the challenge we face in other parts of the world as well is how to sustain these ecosystems that are so precious to us, so crucial to our own survival, while we also live in their presence, live even within them. And I think Wisconsin has some important lessons in that great project.
Today, the profession of forestry lives on the front line of the ongoing struggle to protect and sustain a resource that we need to live off, live on, and live with. The forests, the trees that support the quality of our economic lives, nourish our deep desires to be close to nature, and nurture the very existence of life on our planet. And now that forestry is taking on the challenges of the 21st century, it does so by combining a wisdom informed by the past with the emerging science and technology that will help build a future guided by a vision that will sustain this precious resource, so vital to our material and emotional well-being, Wisconsin's forests.
Something magic about having a piece of wooded land. There's flowers, there's birds, there's animals, there's peace and quiet. I think that's why most people own land. I think aesthetics is very important, along with wildlife management and forest management.
You look at the situation that existed after the early logging and the fires that followed. And you could stand on hills and see for miles. You can stand on the same hills today and you can't barely see beyond 20 feet because of the trees that are in there.
Earth Day should be every day. But I think there's a lot of people now are concerned about the earth and things that are going on. And I think our public owes a small part of that to the foresters because we pushed it. Like I tell my doctor, I says, I had a better job than you. And he always said, well, what did you do? And I told him I was a forester for the state of Wisconsin.
I think that what we will leave here for our future generations is a tremendous, tremendous legacy.